The shuttle shook so hard that I bit down on my own tongue. I gripped the armrest with both hands, my claws digging into the soft padding, and I stared out the viewport at the blue and green world rushing up toward us. My pilot, Thal Voren, was shouting numbers I did not understand, and the ship groaned like it was being torn apart by unseen hands. "Gravity increasing," said the ship's voice. "Radiation levels increasing. Atmospheric pressure increasing." Everything about this planet was increasing. That was the first thing I learned about Earth, and I had not even landed yet. My name is Corvin Thess, and I am an ambassador for the Osemi Accord, a peaceful group of worlds that has spent the last 200 years trying to understand which new species deserve a seat at our table and which ones should be watched from a very safe distance. I have visited 11 planets in my career. I have negotiated with beings made of crystal, beings made of gas, and once, a creature that communicated only through smell. None of those meetings made my hands shake the way this one did. Because Earth was different. Earth was a death world. That is not a name we give lightly. A death world is a planet so hostile, so violent in its very nature, that most life should never survive there at all. Killing gravity, poison air in some regions, storms that could flatten a city. Predators stacked on top of predators, each one more vicious than the last. And somehow, on this small ball of chaos, a species had not only survived, it had built cities. It had built ships that could fly. It had learned to speak to us across the stars and said, quite politely, that it would like to have lunch. That was the invitation. A lunch, at a school. I had read the briefing file 11 times on the journey over, and I still could not decide if it was the strangest idea I had ever heard or the most clever one. The humans wanted a small, informal meeting, away from the pressure of politics. A place where two young ones from each side could sit together and eat, while the adults watched from a respectful distance. Our scientists back home had approved it as low risk. I was starting to think our scientists had never actually looked at the survey reports on this planet. We landed on a strip of gray stone outside a building the humans called a school. The doors opened, and the air of Earth hit me like a wall. It was thick, heavy. It pressed against my chest, the way water might. My own planet has a gentle sky, soft winds, mild light from a calm little sun. Here, the sun was a furnace, and even through my suit, I could feel its heat, trying to find a way in. A human man stood waiting for us at the base of the ramp, smiling in a way that I later learned was meant to be friendly. His name, I would learn, was Daniel Cross, a government liaison assigned to walk us through the visit. Beside him stood a woman named Grace Bennett, a teacher, her hands folded, her expression calm in a way that seemed almost unnatural given everything I now knew about her home planet. "Ambassador Thess," Daniel said, offering his hand. "Welcome to Earth. We're honored to have you." I looked at his hand for a long moment before I remembered the gesture from my briefing notes. I touched my fingers to his, carefully, the way one might touch something that could break. He did not seem to notice how careful I was being. He simply smiled wider. "The honor is ours," I said, though my voice came out thinner than I wanted it to. Behind me, my fellow delegate, a quiet scientist named Ilvath Kor, whispered something under her breath. I did not need translation software to understand it. It was a prayer. On our world, we do not pray often. Ilvath was praying. They led us through a set of doors into a long hallway filled with young humans. Dozens of them. Walking, running, shouting, laughing, all at once, all so loud that my ears rang inside my helmet. I had expected quiet. I had expected order. Instead, I saw chaos, barely contained, moving in every direction, and not one adult seemed alarmed by it. "They are unrestrained," Ilvath said quietly, through our private channel. "They are children," Daniel said, overhearing somehow despite the distance, and I realized then that human hearing was sharper than I had accounted for. "This is just lunchtime. It gets a little loud." A little loud. I made a note in my mind to revise every assumption in my briefing file. We were led into a large room filled with long tables, humans of many sizes sitting together, trays of food in front of them, voices overlapping like waves crashing on top of each other. The smell hit me before anything else, strange, sharp, sweet, and something else beneath it that I could not name, something that made the small hairs along my arms stand up inside my suit. "This way," Grace Bennett said, guiding us toward a table near the window. "We've set it up so you can observe naturally. No pressure, just a normal lunch." A normal lunch. I would come to think of those words very differently before the day was through. At the table sat a single human child. A girl, perhaps 10 years old by their counting, with light brown hair pulled back from her face, a plain blue shirt, and a lunch bag in front of her that looked, to my eyes, entirely unremarkable. She did not look dangerous. She did not look powerful. She looked, if I am honest, small. Fragile, even, the way a young creature on any gentle world might look. Her name, I was told, was Lily Turner. She had been chosen, according to Daniel, simply because she volunteered, and because her teachers said she was calm, polite, and unlikely to be nervous around visitors. Nothing about the file suggested she was special. Nothing about her suggested she was anything other than an ordinary child having an ordinary day. I felt some of the tension in my chest ease as I looked at her. Perhaps, I thought, the danger of this planet lay only in its storms, and its beasts, and its poisoned winds. Perhaps its children, at least, were soft and simple, just like children on every other world I had visited. I sat down across from her, my delegation arranging themselves around the table with the careful stiffness of people trying very hard not to look afraid. Ilvath sat to my left, her scanning device already humming quietly beneath her sleeve, set to record everything for study. Thal Voren sat to my right, his eyes darting toward every human that passed behind him, flinching slightly each time one laughed too loudly. Lily looked up at us and smiled. It was a small, easy smile, without any of the caution I would have expected from a creature meeting beings from another world for the first time. "Hi," she said. "Are you guys from space?" "We are," I answered, doing my best to make my translated voice sound gentle. "We came a very long way to meet you." "That's cool," she said, and then, without any further ceremony, she reached into her lunch bag and began to unpack her meal. I watched her hands as she worked. Small hands, pale, unremarkable. She pulled out a sealed container, a piece of fruit, something wrapped in paper, and a metal tool with a thin, serrated edge that I recognized, after a moment of searching my memory files, as a common eating utensil, a knife. She held it the way a child might hold a toy, loosely, without fear, without any awareness at all that she was holding an edged blade in a room full of dozens of other children, none of whom seemed concerned in the slightest. Beside me, I heard Thal Voren's breathing change. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself this was simply how these creatures ate their meals, a strange custom from a strange world, and that there was no danger in it at all. I told myself many things in that moment, sitting across from a small human girl with a blade in her hand and a smile on her face. I did not yet know how wrong I was to feel any comfort at all. She peeled back the wrapping on her container, and a smell rose up from it that made my stomach twist inside my suit. Something sharp. Something that our sensors, when Ilvath finally dared to check them, would later describe with a word that translated roughly to actively hostile to biological tissue. She picked up her fork. She began to eat. And that, more than anything else that had happened since we landed on this planet, was the moment I understood that Earth had not shown us its true face yet, not even close. We were about to watch a child eat her lunch, and by the end of it, every assumption my people had ever made about this species would lie in ruins around us. I did not know, as I sat there watching her lift the first bite to her mouth, that within the hour I would be searching for the fastest way back to our ship. I did not know that a girl named Lily Turner, with her small hands and her easy smile, was about to teach me more about fear than any battlefield ever had. All I knew, in that first quiet moment, was that something about the way she chewed, calm and unbothered, while the air around her carried a chemical signature that made my own species ill just to breathe, was wrong, in a way I did not yet have words for. I looked at Ilvath. Ilvath looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We simply watched and we waited, and the girl kept eating, entirely unaware that 4 sets of alien eyes were fixed on her, and that far above the school, our ship sat waiting on the gray stone, its engines already warm, as if some part of it already knew we would need to leave in a hurry. The first bite went into her mouth without any hesitation at all. I watched her jaw move, slow and steady, and I waited for some sign of pain, some flicker of discomfort crossing her face. Nothing came. She simply chewed, swallowed, and reached for the next piece of food on her tray, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Ilvath leaned toward me, her voice low enough that only our private channel could carry it. "Ambassador, my sensor is reading trace compounds in that dish that our own medical texts classify as tissue irritants. She should be reacting." "Perhaps your sensor is wrong," I said, though I did not believe it myself. "My sensor has never been wrong," Ilvath said, and there was an edge in her voice I had never heard from her before. Lily glanced up at us, chewing, her eyes curious but not concerned. "You guys keep staring at my lunch," she said, swallowing. "Is it weird looking or something?" "It has an interesting smell," I said carefully, choosing my words the way one might choose steps across thin ice. "Oh, that's the pickles," she said, holding up a small green object speared on her fork. "My mom says I put too much on everything. Want to try one?" She held it out toward me, cheerful, completely without malice, and I stared at the small green shape as if she had offered me a live coal. Behind me, I heard Thal Voren make a sound that I can only describe as a whimper. "That is very kind," I said, "but we cannot eat your food. Our biology is different." "Oh, okay," she said, and popped it into her own mouth without a second thought, chewing happily. I forced myself to look calm, though my hearts, both of them, were beating faster than they had during our descent through the atmosphere. I reminded myself, silently, that this was simply a difference in diet. Every species eats differently. Some of our own trade partners consumed things that would be fatal to me, and I had learned, over the years, not to react with fear every time I witnessed an unfamiliar meal. But then she reached for the metal knife again. She used it the way she had used it before, without care, without hesitation, slicing through a piece of fruit on her tray with a motion so casual it barely seemed to register in her mind at all. The blade caught the light from the window, a small flash of silver, and for one terrible instant I imagined what such an edge could do to soft tissue, to skin, to the thin membranes that covered my own body beneath my suit. She was 10 years old by their reckoning, a child, and she held an edged tool the way I might hold a soft cushion. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noticing my stare. "No," I said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. Everything was wrong. I simply did not yet have the courage to say it out loud." Around us, the noise of the cafeteria rolled on, uninterrupted. Children shouted across tables. Trays clattered. Somewhere behind me, 2 boys collided into each other at full speed, bodies crashing together with a sound like 2 boulders meeting, and both of them simply laughed, picked themselves up, and kept running, as if nothing had happened at all. I flinched at the sound. Ilvath flinched harder. Thal Voren nearly fell out of his seat. "Sorry about them," Grace Bennett said from nearby, smiling apologetically. "Kids will be kids." Kids will be kids. I turned that phrase over in my mind long after she said it, because on my world, kids being kids meant soft laughter, gentle play, careful movements guided by instincts that protected fragile young bodies from harm. Here, on Earth, it apparently meant full-body collisions at running speed, followed by laughter instead of injury. I looked back at Lily. She had not even glanced toward the commotion. It was simply background noise to her, as ordinary as birdsong might be on my own world. She finished the piece of fruit and reached for something else, a small red object that even from a distance made my sensors along my forearm begin to pulse with a soft warning light. I glanced down at my own wrist display, hidden beneath my sleeve, and watched the numbers climb as she lifted the object to her mouth. "Ilvath," I whispered. "What is that?" Ilvath's scanning device hummed as she angled it slightly beneath the table, careful not to let the humans notice. A moment later, her voice came through our channel, tight and strained. "It appears to be a cultivated plant, a member of a family known, in Earth's own scientific texts, for producing compounds that trigger significant pain response in most biological tissue. The data calls it a pepper." "A pepper," I repeated. "She is eating it whole." I watched, my breath caught somewhere behind my ribs as Lily bit into the small red pepper without flinching, chewed twice, swallowed, and reached for her drink almost as an afterthought, taking a small sip before setting it back down. "A little spicy today," she said cheerfully, mostly to herself. "Mom must have gotten a hot batch." A hot batch, as if this were a matter of preference, as if the very thing that could send my own delegation into a medical emergency was to her simply a note on flavor, mild enough to comment on, but not even worth pausing her meal over. Thal Voren leaned close to me, his voice shaking. "Ambassador, I request permission to return to the ship." "Not yet," I said, though every part of me agreed with him. "She just ate fire," he whispered, "with her bare mouth. And she is still smiling." "We are here to observe," I said, though my own voice wavered as I said it. "We cannot leave after a single meal." Even as I said the words, I understood how foolish they sounded. This was not simply a single meal. This was a window into something far larger, something that our species had never truly understood about Earth, despite decades of distant observation. We had studied their storms, we had studied their wars, their weapons, their history of conflict layered upon conflict. We had never once thought to study their lunch. Lily set down her fork for a moment and looked at us more closely, her head tilting slightly to one side. "You guys are really quiet," she said. "Is this your first time meeting people from Earth?" "Yes," I said. "You are the first human child any of us have spoken with directly." "That's kind of cool," she said, smiling again. "I've never met an alien before either. My friend Ellie is so jealous she couldn't come today." "We are honored to be your first," I said, and I meant it, though the honor felt increasingly tangled together with a growing, quiet dread. She reached into her lunch bag once more and pulled out a small square of something pale yellow wrapped in thin paper. She unwrapped it, revealing a soft, pungent block that carried a smell so sharp it made my eyes water even through my suit's filtration system. Beside me, Ilvath's scanning device let out a small, distressed beep before she silenced it quickly with her hand. "What is that?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "Cheese," she said, as if the answer were obvious. "It's kind of stinky, but I like it. Want a piece?" "No," I said, perhaps too quickly, and she laughed, not unkindly, simply amused. "You guys really don't want to try anything, huh?" "Our bodies are not built the same way yours are," I said, and this, at least, was becoming truer with every passing second. She shrugged and took a bite of the cheese, chewing thoughtfully, her expression calm and untroubled, as if the smell that had nearly overwhelmed 4 trained diplomats was, to her, simply a pleasant part of her afternoon. I glanced at Daniel Cross and Grace Bennett, both of them standing a short distance away, watching the interaction with warm, approving smiles, entirely unaware of the storm building beneath the surface of our calm expressions. To them, this was a charming cultural exchange, a child sharing her lunch with curious visitors. To us, it was becoming something else entirely, a demonstration, unintentional, unrehearsed, and all the more terrifying for it. Lily finished the cheese and moved on to the last item in her lunch bag, a small container filled with something dark and thick that she ate with a spoon, humming quietly to herself between bites. I did not ask what it was. I did not think my hearts could take another answer. Instead, I watched her hands. Small, steady, unbothered. I watched the way she held her utensils, the way she moved without any awareness of the blade in her grip, or the fire in her food, or the sharp, stinging smell rising from every dish in front of her. I watched a creature who, by every measure my people used to judge danger, should have been in agony, and who instead looked, more than anything else, simply content, bored even, as if this were the least remarkable thing that had happened to her all day. "You know," she said, swallowing the last spoonful, "lunch today wasn't even that exciting. Yesterday we had tacos." Tacos. I did not know what a taco was, and in that moment I found that I did not want to know. Whatever it was, I suspected it would only make things worse. Beside me, Thal Voren had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the empty container in front of Lily, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Ilvath's scanning device had gone quiet, though I noticed her fingers trembling slightly where they rested against the table's edge. I understood, in that moment, that we were no longer simply observing a meal. We were gathering evidence, and every piece of it pointed toward a single, uncomfortable truth that none of us were yet ready to speak aloud. This child, ordinary by every account given to us, unremarkable in the eyes of her own species, had just consumed a meal that would have hospitalized and quite possibly killed every member of our delegation. And she had done it while laughing about pickles, sharing cheese, and mentioning tacos, as if the whole experience were nothing more than an average Tuesday. If this was ordinary, I thought, my hands finally beginning to shake beneath the table, then what, exactly, was extraordinary on this planet? And more importantly, what would it take to make a creature like this one afraid? I did not want to find out. But some quiet, professional part of me, the part that had chosen this career because I wanted to understand every corner of the galaxy, needed to know. I glanced at Ilvath. She met my eyes, and I saw my own fear reflected back at me. "Run the deeper scan," I whispered. "We need to understand what we are truly looking at." Ilvath's hand hovered over her device for a long moment, before she finally nodded, her fingers steadying just enough to begin the work that would soon reveal exactly how far beneath the surface this child's strength truly ran. The next few minutes should have been calm. Instead, they became the moment my careful composure began to crack open like a shell under pressure. Ella Sutton reached into her bag once more and pulled out a smaller container, one she had clearly saved for last. Grace Dawson, still standing nearby, explained with obvious pride that this was Ella's favorite part of lunch, something she always ate slowly, savoring it. I remember thinking, with a strange flicker of hope, that perhaps this final item would be something gentle, something soft, something that would finally match the innocent picture we had wanted to believe in the first place. It was not. Inside the container sat a single, small, round vegetable, pale green in color, with thin rings cut through it. Grace called it a jalapeno, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ella had been eating spicy food since she was very small because her family enjoyed cooking with heat. I did not understand the word spicy at the time, not fully, though Illa's translator whispered a rough definition into my ear, something about compounds that caused a burning sensation on human tongues, compounds that many human children avoided until they grew older. Ella picked up the small green ring between two fingers, popped it into her mouth without hesitation, and chewed. "I want you to understand something about my species. We do not have a concept for casually consuming a substance capable of causing pain. Every meal we have ever eaten across the entire history of Ilith has been designed, refined, and tested across generations specifically to avoid any sensation of discomfort. Pain, to us, is something to be prevented at all costs, something so foreign to our daily experience that even mild irritation sends most of my people to a healer." Sanira's recording device chimed again, louder this time, and she leaned so close to me that her shoulder pressed against mine. Her readings, she whispered, showed a clear physiological response. Ella's mouth had, in fact, registered the burning compound exactly as it should, a genuine, measurable reaction across her nerve endings. And yet, watching the girl's face, I saw only the faintest widening of her eyes, followed almost immediately by a small, satisfied smile, as though she had simply confirmed that her snack tasted exactly the way she expected it to. She reached for a small carton of juice, took a sip, and continued talking to Caleb about his dog drawing as though nothing at all had happened. Torv made a small sound beside me, somewhere between a cough and a gasp, and I placed a firm hand briefly on his arm to steady him. I understood his reaction completely, because my own throat had tightened in a way I did not enjoy. Dale, still taking notes with admirable calm, murmured that human history contained countless references to what they called cuisine, built entirely around compounds designed to cause controlled pain, entire cultures competing to create food that burned more intensely than the last, treating discomfort not as something to avoid, but as something to enjoy, even celebrate. I asked him, quietly, why any species would choose to feel pain voluntarily, repeatedly, for pleasure. He had no answer. Neither did I, and that absence of an answer frightened me more than any answer could have. Grace Dawson, still smiling warmly, unaware of the storm quietly gathering at our table, mentioned that Ella's older brother enjoyed even spicier food, peppers that made most adults reach immediately for water, and that their family sometimes held friendly competitions to see who could handle the most heat without needing to stop. A competition, I thought, built around tolerating something my entire civilization had structured itself around avoiding. Ella finished the jalapeno, wiped her fingers on a small paper napkin, and reached for the small metal tool again, the ridged one, using it this time to scrape the last bit of white spread from its container onto a final piece of bread. Her fingers moved with total confidence around an object that Torv could not stop staring at, his security training clearly screaming warnings his mind could not fully process, because nothing about a child at a lunch table should have triggered his instincts this strongly. And yet it did. Sanira leaned toward me again, her voice low and urgent this time, no longer simply curious, but genuinely alarmed. She told me her scans had picked up something else entirely, something in Ella's blood readings that did not match any baseline we had recorded from adult humans during our earlier scans of their military personnel and public officials. This was not an adult trained for endurance. This was a child, still growing, still years away from whatever physical peak her species reached, already displaying resilience that our own trained specialists would struggle to match. I asked her to explain further, though part of me did not want the answer. She said that Ella's body appeared to process foreign compounds, whether from spice, from bacteria naturally present in fermented foods, or from the animal proteins she had already consumed, at a speed and efficiency that suggested an immune and digestive system built for constant low-level battle. Not extraordinary battle, not battle against invading armies or terrible monsters, simply the daily, unglamorous battle of existing on a planet where the food itself, the air itself, the very ground itself, offered no guarantee of safety. This was not a warrior sitting before us. This was an ordinary child, eating an ordinary lunch, and her ordinary body was already outperforming systems that had taken my own physicians years to fully map on adult human soldiers. I felt something cold settle into my chest, a feeling I did not have a proper word for in my own language, though Illa later told me the closest human word might be dread. Around us, the room continued its cheerful chaos. Children laughed, trays clattered. Someone dropped a small container of what Grace called yogurt onto the floor, and instead of reacting with alarm, the children nearby simply laughed, and one of them cleaned it up with a paper towel while joking about it. No one panicked over a mess. No one panicked over spilled food. No one panicked over anything at all. I realized, watching this unfold, that panic itself seemed to be a rare currency among these young humans, spent only for events far more serious than we could yet imagine, while things that would have sent my own people into a full emergency response barely registered as an inconvenience worth mentioning. Ella finished her final piece of bread, folded her now empty lunch container closed with practiced hands, and turned to Caleb to ask if he wanted to trade some of his own food for a small sweet treat she had saved, something Grace called a cookie. Caleb agreed happily, and the two of them exchanged items across the table with the easy familiarity of friends who did this every single day. I watched this exchange happen and found myself thinking, absurdly, that this simple trade, food passed casually between two young humans without a single thought of danger, said more about their species than any military report our scouts had ever compiled. Dale must have noticed the shift in my posture, because he leaned toward me and asked, quietly, whether I wished to end the observation early. I told him no, though my voice did not sound entirely steady, even to my own ears. I told him we needed to see more, because whatever conclusions we drew from this single lunch would shape how our entire delegation reported back to Ilith, and I did not want to base something this important on incomplete information. Sanira, still monitoring her readings, suddenly went very still beside me. I asked her what was wrong. She said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she had just detected something in Ella's biological signature that she needed to confirm with additional scans before she could be certain. She did not want to alarm anyone prematurely, she said, but the readings suggested something about human pain tolerance that went far beyond anything we had documented before. Something that, if confirmed, would need to be reported immediately to our home council, regardless of how it might affect ongoing trade negotiations. I asked her to explain. She hesitated, glancing once more at her device, then looked up at me with an expression I had rarely seen on her calm, scholarly face. It was the look of someone who had found an answer she had not wanted to find. She told me we needed to keep watching, because Ella was not finished with her lunch yet, and whatever came next would either confirm her suspicion or put it to rest entirely. I turned my attention back to the small human girl sitting only a short distance away, still laughing quietly with her friend, still utterly unaware that she had become the single most important subject of study for an entire alien delegation. She reached for one final item on her tray, something small and round that Grace had called a lemon wedge, part of a drink garnish that most humans, she mentioned, only used for flavor rather than eating directly. Ella, however, picked up the lemon wedge and without any hesitation at all, bit directly into it, rind and all. The table went silent in my mind, though the room around us continued its cheerful noise uninterrupted. I watched Ella's face carefully, waiting for some reaction, some sign of the discomfort that such an intensely sour taste should have produced. Her eyes squeezed shut for a brief moment, her shoulders gave a small involuntary shiver, and then she simply smiled, swallowed, and reached for her drink to wash it down, already turning back to her conversation with Caleb as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. Sanira's device chimed one final time, and this time she did not lean toward me quietly. She simply turned her screen so I could see it directly, her hand trembling slightly as she held it up. The readings showed exactly what she had feared. A full, measurable pain response, recorded clearly in Ella's nervous system, followed within seconds by what her instruments labeled as complete physiological recovery, as though the pain itself had simply been acknowledged, filed away, and dismissed. I looked from the screen to the girl herself, still laughing, still chewing, still utterly unaware of the storm her simple lunch had caused among 5 alien visitors who had traveled across the stars expecting to find comfort in her innocence. Instead, we had found something else entirely, something none of us were yet prepared to fully name, though each of us, I think, already sensed its shape forming quietly in the back of our minds. Dale was the one who finally said it aloud, his voice low and careful, meant only for our small table to hear. If this, he said, is what an ordinary child endures without complaint during a single ordinary meal, then we have gravely misunderstood exactly what kind of species we came here to meet. None of us answered him, because none of us yet knew how to answer, and somewhere across the room, Ella Sutton reached for a second cookie, entirely unaware that her simple lunch had just become the single most alarming piece of intelligence our delegation had gathered since arriving on Earth. Ilvath's scanner began its work in silence, a thin beam, invisible to human eyes, sweeping gently across the space where Lily sat, gathering information about her body the way a cautious hand might gather details about a sleeping beast. I kept my own face calm, nodding along as Lily chattered about her school day, about a test she had taken that morning, about a drawing she was working on for an art class. I heard almost none of it. My attention was fixed on the small display hidden beneath Ilvath's sleeve, watching numbers scroll past faster than I could properly read them. "Ambassador," Ilvath said quietly, her voice tight, "I need you to look at this." I leaned toward her, keeping my posture relaxed for the benefit of the humans watching nearby, and glanced down at her display. Rows of data filled the small screen, comparisons drawn automatically between Lily's readings and the baseline figures for every species in our shared archive. "Her cellular repair rate," Ilvath whispered, "is nearly 4 times faster than our own." "Perhaps the scanner is miscalibrated," I said, though I no longer believed my own suggestions. "I have calibrated this device myself, every cycle, for the last 6 years," Ilvath said. "It is not miscalibrated. Her body heals itself at a rate that would let her recover from an injury that would take one of us a full season, in the space of a few days." I looked at Lily again. She was laughing at something Daniel had said, her small hands folded on the table, utterly unaware that she was being measured, catalogued, and quietly feared by beings who had crossed the stars to meet her. "There is more," Ilvath said. "Her immune markers show active resistance to at least a dozen microbial signatures our medical database classifies as universally hostile. Her body is not simply tolerating these threats, it is actively defeating them without any noticeable effort." "How is that possible?" Thalvoran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because this is a Deathworld," I said, and saying the words aloud finally made the truth of them settle into my chest like a stone. Every generation of humans that did not carry these traits did not survive long enough to have children. This planet has spent countless centuries selecting only the strongest, most resistant bodies to continue forward. What we are looking at is not a gifted individual, it is the average result of that selection. "She is the average," Ilvath repeated slowly, as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. "Not the exception." I did not answer, because I did not need to. The truth of it was already settling over our small table like a fog, cold and unwelcome. Lily reached for the last item on her tray, a small piece of fruit with a firm skin, and bit into it without preamble. As she chewed, I noticed something on her hand, a thin, pale line running across one knuckle. "What happened there?" I asked, gesturing carefully toward the mark, keeping my tone light. She glanced down at her hand and shrugged. "Oh, this? I cut it on a fence a few weeks ago. It's basically gone now." "A few weeks," I repeated. "Yeah, it bled a lot at first, but my mom just put a bandage on it, and it healed up pretty fast." Ilvath's fingers twitched against her scanner. I understood why. On our world, an injury deep enough to bleed significantly would require weeks of careful medical care, assisted healing technology, and close monitoring to avoid infection. Here, it seemed, a scraped hand was treated with a small strip of fabric and forgotten within days. I watched her finish the piece of fruit, then reach for a small bottle of water, twisting the cap with a quick, careless motion of her wrist. The plastic cap gave a small crack as it broke free, a sound so minor that none of the humans around us even glanced toward it. To me, it sounded like the snapping of a bone. "Could you," I said carefully, my curiosity now outweighing my caution, "show me something. A simple task, nothing dangerous. I am curious how your body works." She tilted her head, considering the request, with the mild confusion of a child being asked an unusual favor. Like what? I glanced around the table, searching for something harmless, something that would not draw attention from the watching adults, and my eyes landed on a small, sealed jar sitting near the edge of a nearby lunch tray, abandoned by another student, its metal lid stuck fast from disuse. "That jar," I said. "Could you open it?" She reached over, without hesitation, picked up the jar, and twisted the lid. There was a small pop, as the seal broke, and she handed it back toward its owner, a boy 2 seats down, who thanked her, without even looking up from his own conversation. It had taken her less than 2 seconds. No strain crossed her face, no exertion showed in her small hands. It was, to her, an act as thoughtless as blinking. "Was that okay?" she asked, glancing back at me. "It didn't look that hard." "It was very helpful," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Beside me, Thal Voren leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "Ambassador, I could not open that jar, not without tools." "Neither could I admitted quietly. We sat in silence for a long moment, watching Lily gather the last of her lunch items back into her bag, humming a tune under her breath, entirely unaware of the quiet crisis unfolding around her. Around the cafeteria, other children continued their meals, their games, their endless motion, each one, I now understood, carrying within their small bodies the same terrible resilience we had just witnessed in miniature. "Ambassador," Ilvath said, her voice carrying a note of genuine fear now, unmasked by any pretense of professionalism, "I need to show you something else." I ran a passive scan of the room while we were seated here. She angled her display toward me, and I saw a wider map now, dozens of small markers scattered across the cafeteria, each one representing a child at their own table, eating their own meal. "Every single one of them," Ilvath said, "shows similar readings: elevated pain tolerance, rapid healing markers, active resistance to compounds that would be fatal to us. This is not something unique to the girl we were seated with. This is the baseline for the entire species, even in its youngest, most vulnerable members." I felt something cold settle in my chest, a fear that went beyond simple alarm and into something closer to awe. If children, unformed and still growing, carried this level of resilience without any training or preparation, what might a fully grown adult of this species be capable of during a genuine conflict? What might their soldiers endure? What might their warriors survive? "Ambassador," Thal Voren said quietly, "I do not think we are equipped to understand what we are looking at." "No," I agreed, "I do not think we are." I thought back to the historical briefing I had studied on our journey here, pages filled with dry summaries of Earth's past. Ice ages that should have ended their species before it began, diseases that swept across their world in waves and were, each time, eventually overcome, centuries of conflict between their own nations, weapons growing more terrible with each passing generation, and still, somehow, their numbers continued to grow rather than collapse. I had read these facts as simple historical data, distant and abstract. Sitting across from Lily Turner, watching her twist open a jar with less effort than I used to open a door, those facts stopped being abstract at all. "She is 10 years old," I said quietly, mostly to myself. "And she just outperformed every member of this delegation in a simple test of strength," Ilvath said, without trying, without noticing, and without any understanding that she had done anything remarkable at all. Lily looked up from securing her lunch bag, catching the tense silence at our table, and her brow furrowed slightly with concern. "Is everything okay? You guys look kind of pale. Well, more pale than before, I mean." "We are simply thinking about our journey home," I said, forcing a calm I did not feel into my voice. "Oh, okay," she said, though her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. "You can ask me more questions if you want. I don't mind." I wanted, more than almost anything I had wanted in my long career, to end the questions there and retreat quietly to our ship. But some stubborn professional instinct held me in place a moment longer. "One more question," I said. "Have you ever been seriously hurt? An injury that frightened you?" She considered this for a moment, chewing on the inside of her cheek in thought. "I broke my arm 2 summers ago, falling off my bike. That hurt a lot at first, but it healed up in like 6 weeks, and now it's totally fine. I can even do more push-ups on that arm now than before, actually. My gym teacher said sometimes that happens. 6 weeks. A broken limb, mended and strengthened in 6 weeks, with nothing more than what I gathered was a simple protective covering and rest." Ilvath's scanner buzzed softly beside me, confirming numbers that already matched what my own instincts had begun to suspect. This was not a fragile species hiding behind clever technology. This was a species built, quite literally, by the harshest possible conditions, into something that could absorb damage that would end most other forms of life, and come back from it stronger than before. I thought of our own people, gentle and calm, raised on a world with soft winds and mild seasons, where a broken limb might mean months of careful, anxious healing, and I felt, for the first time since arriving on this planet, a fear that went beyond simple caution and settled instead into something close to genuine dread. We had come here to observe a lunch. We were leaving with an understanding that would change how our entire civilization viewed this small, blue world and the deceptively ordinary children who called it home. Lily zipped her lunch bag closed and smiled at us again, entirely unaware of the storm her simple, honest answers had stirred within 4 visitors from across the stars. "Thanks for coming to eat lunch with me," she said cheerfully. "This was fun. Do you guys want to come back tomorrow?" Beside me, I heard Thalvorin make a small, strangled sound that he quickly disguised as a cough. I opened my mouth to answer her, though I was not yet certain what words would come out, and it was in that exact moment that something happened at the table that would push our quiet, contained fear into something far closer to panic. Sanira did not wait for permission before beginning what she later called a full passive assessment. On Islith, our physicians moved slowly, carefully, always announcing their intentions before conducting even the simplest examination. Watching her work quietly and quickly, without a single word to the subject she studied, reminded me uncomfortably of how little our customs prepared us for a world like this one. She explained her findings to me in low, rapid whispers as the lunch period continued around us, the noise of children's laughter forming a strange, cheerful backdrop to what felt increasingly like an emergency briefing. Ella's immune markers, Sanira said, showed constant low-level activity, a background hum of defense that never fully switched off. On Islith, our bodies rest most of the time, only activating strong immune responses when something genuinely threatens us, because our environment rarely presents such threats. Here, in this child, the reading suggested a body permanently prepared for battle against invisible enemies, bacteria, viruses, toxins, all of it treated as a normal condition of existing rather than a rare emergency. I asked her what this meant in practical terms. She said it meant Ella's body had likely already survived, without her even realizing it, dozens of minor illnesses that would have required extensive medical intervention on Islith. Her body handled these threats automatically, constantly, silently, the same way she chewed her sandwich or laughed at her friend's drawing, without any conscious awareness of the battle occurring beneath her skin. Dale, listening closely, added a piece of history he had studied before our arrival. He reminded us that human children were regularly given deliberate doses of weakened diseases, a practice they called vaccination, specifically to train their immune systems in advance, treating the body itself as something that could be prepared for war before the war ever arrived. I found myself thinking of our own medical practices, gentle treatments designed to remove any discomfort as quickly as possible, and comparing them to a species that intentionally exposed its children to controlled versions of dangerous illnesses simply to strengthen them for whatever came next. Torv, still visibly unsettled beside me, asked quietly whether this meant every human child walked around with these hidden battles happening constantly inside their bodies. Sanira confirmed that yes, this appeared to be the standard condition for the species, not an exception, not a special case, but the baseline expectation for every single human alive. I turned my attention back to Ella, who had finished her cookie and was now laughing at something Caleb had said, her cheeks slightly flushed with the simple joy of a shared joke. It became increasingly difficult to reconcile the image before me, an ordinary child enjoying an ordinary meal, with the quiet, constant internal war that Sanira's instruments insisted was happening inside her at that very moment. Grace Dawson approached our table again, still smiling, still entirely unaware of the tension radiating from our small group. She asked if we had any questions about what we were observing, clearly hoping to hear something pleasant, something that confirmed her hope that this simple demonstration had reassured us. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, whether Ella had ever been seriously ill. Grace laughed softly and said, of course, all children get sick sometimes, though Ella was generally quite healthy. She mentioned a bout of something called influenza the previous winter, describing it casually as though recalling a minor inconvenience rather than what Sanira's face suggested was, by our standards, a genuinely dangerous biological event. I asked what happened during this illness. Grace shrugged and said Ella stayed home from school for a few days, rested, drank fluids, and recovered fully within about a week, without any need for hospitalization. Sanira's hand tightened slightly around her recording device. She explained to me later, once Grace had moved away to check on another table, that influenza, based on our scans of Earth's medical records, killed a measurable number of humans every single year across the planet, particularly among the very young and very old. And yet here was a child who had faced this same illness and simply rested for a few days before returning to laughing over lunch with her friends as though nothing significant had occurred. Dale pointed out that this pattern repeated throughout human history in ways that continued to astonish him the more he studied it. Plagues that erased significant portions of populations across centuries had, each time, eventually been followed by recovery, rebuilding, and continued growth. Where other species might have viewed such repeated devastation as reason for despair, humans appeared to simply endure, adapt, and continue forward, treating catastrophe as an obstacle to overcome rather than an ending to fear. I found myself asking, quietly, whether our own species could have survived even a fraction of what Earth's history contained. None of my colleagues answered, and their silence told me everything I needed to know. Ela, who had remained mostly quiet throughout the observation, finally spoke up, her young voice slightly unsteady. She mentioned that during her translation training, she had studied human phrases and expressions extensively, and one phrase in particular kept appearing across their culture in various forms, a saying about "what does not end you makes you stronger." She asked if this phrase might explain what we were witnessing, an entire species that had built philosophy and belief around embracing hardship rather than avoiding it. Dale considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. He said it was possible, even likely, that humanity's relationship with suffering differed fundamentally from our own, not because they enjoyed pain, but because their entire evolutionary and cultural history had never given them the option to avoid it. Where we removed discomfort at every opportunity, they had learned, through countless generations of necessity, to work alongside it, through it, and eventually past it. I considered this explanation carefully, watching Ella wipe crumbs from her school uniform with the back of her hand, entirely unaware of the depth of analysis her simple lunch had inspired among visitors from another world. Sanira's instruments chimed again, softer this time, and she glanced down before looking back up at me with an expression that had shifted from alarm into something closer to fascination, mixed with dread. She explained that she had just detected something in Ella's muscular readings, a density and efficiency that, while still developing due to her young age, already exceeded what our own physicians would expect from adult specimens of similar body size. She clarified quickly that this did not mean Ella possessed extraordinary strength by human standards, simply average strength for her species, but that average human strength, pound for pound, already surpassed what our own bodies could produce, even with extensive physical training. Torv asked, his voice tight, what this meant for adult humans, particularly those trained specifically for physical tasks. Sanira did not answer immediately, and her silence stretched long enough that I felt a fresh wave of unease settle over our small table. When she finally spoke, she said that if a child at rest, simply sitting and eating lunch, already displayed baseline capabilities this far beyond our own trained specialists, then a trained adult human, particularly one specifically prepared for physical or combative roles, would likely represent something far beyond anything our species had previously encountered in any species we had studied across known space. The room around us continued its cheerful noise, children finishing their meals, some already rising from their seats to deposit trays and head toward whatever activity awaited them next, all of it happening with the easy, unconcerned rhythm of a species that had no idea their ordinary lunch period had just delivered devastating intelligence to a delegation from another star system. Dale, ever the historian, offered one final observation that settled over our table like a heavy weight. He reminded us that everything we had witnessed so far, the casual consumption of substances designed to cause discomfort, the constant hidden battle against disease, the muscular efficiency exceeding our own trained specialists, all of it belonged to a single, unremarkable child selected specifically because her teacher considered her a normal, well-rounded example of her species. This was not an exceptional human. This was, by every measure Grace Dawson had offered us, an entirely typical one. I asked Dale quietly what this meant for our understanding of humanity as a whole. He said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that if this was typical, then perhaps our council back on Ilith had drastically underestimated exactly what kind of species had just extended a hand of friendship toward the rest of the galaxy. Torv shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward the exit of the cafeteria, as though calculating how quickly we might reasonably excuse ourselves. I understood the impulse, because a similar thought had already begun forming in my own mind, though I resisted it for the moment, unwilling to abandon our observation before gathering complete information. Sanira, meanwhile, continued her careful, quiet scanning, her earlier scientific curiosity now fully transformed into something closer to genuine concern. She mentioned, almost to herself, that she wished to compare Ella's readings against those of the other children in the room, curious whether this single child represented an outlier or a perfect, unremarkable example of her entire species. Grace Dawson, still moving between tables with warm, oblivious cheerfulness, called out to the room that lunch period would end in a few minutes, prompting a fresh wave of activity as children began gathering their trays and belongings. Ella Sutton stood from her seat, stretched with the easy, unconscious movement of a body that had never once considered its own capabilities extraordinary, and picked up her now empty lunch container along with her tray. She said something to Caleb that made him laugh loudly, then turned to walk toward the tray return station near the front of the room, her steps light, unhurried, utterly ordinary. I watched her walk away and found myself thinking of everything we had witnessed in the span of a single, brief lunch period. A child who consumed substances designed to cause pain without complaint, a body engaged in constant, silent battle against invisible threats, muscular capabilities already exceeding our trained specialists, and an entire cultural philosophy built around treating hardship not as something to fear, but as something to overcome. Dale leaned back in his seat, his earlier calm now replaced by something far more sober. He said quietly that our delegation had come to Earth expecting to negotiate with a species we believed we understood, at least in broad strokes, based on our long-range observations and historical records. What we had actually found, sitting quietly among laughing children and half-eaten sandwiches, was something our records had never fully prepared us to comprehend. Sanira nodded slowly in agreement, her earlier fascination now tinged with something close to genuine fear. She said that if this lunch period represented humanity's baseline, their ordinary, unremarkable existence, then she could hardly imagine what an actual crisis, an actual threat to their species, might reveal about their true capabilities. I did not answer her immediately, because my own mind had already begun turning toward a single, uncomfortable question that I suspected each of my colleagues was silently asking themselves as well. If this was ordinary, what, exactly, was extraordinary for a species like this? None of us spoke the question aloud, not yet, though I could see it reflected in each of their expressions as clearly as if they had shouted it across the table. Around us, the cafeteria continued emptying as children filed out toward their next class, their voices fading gradually into the hallway beyond, leaving our small table increasingly isolated in a room that suddenly felt far larger and far more unsettling than it had only an hour before. Grace Dawson returned to our table one final time, still smiling warmly, and asked if we had enjoyed the observation, clearly hoping for pleasant confirmation of everything she believed she had shown us. I thanked her, my voice carefully controlled, and told her the observation had been extremely informative, which was, in its own way, entirely true. She had no idea, standing there with her warm, welcoming smile, exactly how informative that simple lunch period had truly been, nor did she understand that her small, unremarkable student had just become the single most important piece of intelligence our delegation would carry back across the stars. Lily reached for one last piece of fruit she had saved for later, a small round shape she popped into her mouth whole, still smiling as she turned to answer my unspoken question. Halfway through her sentence, she stopped, her eyes widening slightly, and a short, sharp cough broke from her throat. My hearts, both of them, seized at once. She coughed again, harder this time, one hand rising to her chest, and for one terrible frozen second, every alarm in my body screamed that we were about to witness a medical emergency unfold in front of us. Ilvath went rigid beside me. Thal Voren half rose from his seat, uncertain what to do, his eyes darting toward Daniel and Grace, as if searching for permission to act. Lily coughed a third time, more forcefully, and then, with a small, wet sound, cleared whatever had lodged itself in her throat, took a quick breath, and reached for her water bottle, taking a long drink before setting it back down with a satisfied sigh. "Sorry," she said, her voice slightly hoarse. "Swallowed that one too fast." None of us moved. None of us spoke. She looked between our stunned faces, confusion creasing her brow. "Are you guys okay? You look kind of freaked out." "You choked," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "A little," she said, shrugging. "It happens sometimes. I'm fine now, see?" She smiled to demonstrate, tapping her own chest lightly with one hand. I stared at her, and for the first time since we had landed on this planet, I understood the true weight of the word Deathworld in a way no briefing document had ever managed to convey. On my own world, an obstruction of the airway was treated as a critical emergency, requiring immediate medical intervention, monitoring equipment, and careful follow-up care to ensure no lasting damage had occurred. Here, on Earth, a child cleared her own throat with a few sharp coughs, took a drink of water, and returned to the conversation as though nothing at all had happened. "You just recovered," Ilvath said quietly, almost to herself. "Alone, without help." "I mean, yeah," Lily said, still clearly puzzled by our reaction. "That's just what you do when you swallow something wrong. Everyone does that. Everyone does that." The casual certainty in her voice was almost more frightening than the moment itself. To her, what we had just witnessed was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that she could not understand why 4 visitors from another world were staring at her as though she had just performed a miracle. Before any of us could recover fully from that moment, a new disturbance arrived at our table. A boy, running at full speed through the narrow aisle between tables, misjudged his path and collided directly into Lily's shoulder, the full force of his sprint transferring into the impact. I flinched so violently that I nearly fell from my own seat. The boy stumbled backward from the force of the collision, catching himself against a nearby table, laughing as he did so. "Sorry, Lily." Lily herself had barely moved. Her shoulder had absorbed the impact of a full-grown child running at top speed, and she had done little more than shift slightly in her seat, one hand rising briefly to steady her cup of water before it could tip. "Watch where you're running, Noah," she called after him, though there was no anger in her voice, only mild, familiar exasperation, the tone of someone mildly annoyed by a common, harmless occurrence. The boy, apparently named Noah, waved an apology over his shoulder and continued running toward his friends without a second thought. I sat frozen, staring at the space where the collision had occurred, running the numbers through my mind, again and again. A full-grown human child, moving at a considerable speed, had struck Lily with enough force to send weaker beings sprawling to the floor, and she had absorbed the impact with less visible reaction than I might show upon being startled by a loud noise. "Ambassador," Thal Voren whispered, his voice trembling now without any attempt to hide it. "Did you see that?" "I saw it," I said. "She barely moved." "I know. If a creature that size struck one of us with that much force," he continued, his words coming faster now, tumbling over each other in his rising panic, "we would require immediate medical attention, possibly worse." I did not answer him, because there was nothing comforting I could say. He was right, and we both knew it. I thought back, suddenly, to every historical record I had studied about this planet, files I had read as simple background information, distant facts about a species I had expected to find curious, but ultimately manageable, their history of surviving diseases that should have ended them, their long, brutal winters that should have starved them into extinction, their endless conflicts, fought with weapons of increasing horror, generation after generation, and still their numbers grew rather than shrank. I had read all of this as data, numbers on a page. Now, watching a 10-year-old girl casually absorb a collision that would have injured or possibly killed a member of my own species, those numbers stopped being abstract history and became something far more immediate and far more terrifying. This was not a species that had gotten lucky. This was not a fluke of evolution that had produced one uniquely resilient individual sitting across from us by chance. This was the baseline, the average, the ordinary condition of every single member of this species, down to its smallest, youngest children, casually eating lunch and running through hallways without any awareness of how remarkable their own bodies truly were. "Ambassador," Ilvath said quietly, her voice carrying a formal weight that told me she had reached a decision, "I believe we have gathered more than sufficient data for our initial report. I would recommend we return to the ship." I looked at her, then at Thal Voren, whose hands were now visibly shaking where they rested against the table, and finally at Lily, who had returned to gathering the last of her belongings, humming quietly to herself, utterly unaware of the quiet terror she had inspired in 4 visitors from across the galaxy, simply by living an entirely normal day. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I believe you are right." I turned toward Daniel Cross, who stood a short distance away, still smiling, with the warm, oblivious pride of someone who believed this visit had gone wonderfully well. I forced my own expression into something resembling calm gratitude, though every instinct in my body was now screaming at me to move toward the door as quickly as dignity would allow. "Mr. Cross," I said, "we are deeply grateful for this visit. However, we have received word that matters require our attention back at our vessel. I am afraid we must conclude our time here sooner than planned." Daniel's smile faltered slightly, confusion crossing his features. "Oh, of course, Ambassador. I hope everything is all right?" "Everything is fine," I said, the lie sitting uneasily on my tongue. "We simply have pressing obligations to attend to." Grace Bennett stepped forward, her expression gently concerned. "I hope Lily wasn't too much trouble. She can be a chatterbox sometimes." "She was no trouble at all," I said, and this, at least, was entirely true. Lily herself had done nothing wrong. She had simply existed, eaten her lunch, laughed with her friends, and absorbed a collision without complaint, and in doing so, she had revealed more about her species than any diplomatic briefing ever could. Lily looked up from her seat, tilting her head as she noticed the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "Are you guys leaving already?" "We must, unfortunately," I said, softening my voice as best I could. "But we are very grateful to have met you." "Oh, okay," she said, her disappointment plain but not overwhelming. "It was nice meeting you guys too. Maybe you can come back sometime. I could show you my drawings next time." "Perhaps," I said, though privately I suspected that no member of our delegation would be volunteering for a return visit any time soon. She waved cheerfully as we rose from the table, her small hand moving in a simple, friendly gesture that suddenly seemed, in light of everything we had just witnessed, like the wave of something far more powerful than any of us had been prepared to meet. As we turned to walk toward the exit, Ilvath leaned close to me one final time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ambassador, we need to send an emergency transmission the moment we are back aboard the ship." "I know," I said. "They cannot know we are afraid," Thal Voren added quietly, glancing nervously back over his shoulder toward the cafeteria we were leaving behind. "They already suspect it," I said, thinking of Daniel's confused expression, Grace's gentle concern, and the small, curious frown Lily had worn as she watched us gather ourselves too quickly for a visit that had supposedly gone well. We did not run toward the exit, though every instinct urged us to. We walked, carefully, deliberately, maintaining what dignity we could, while behind us, a 10-year-old girl finished packing away the remains of a lunch that had just quietly redefined everything my people believed about the dangers waiting among the stars. It happened in a single, terrible second, the kind of moment that arrives without warning and rearranges everything you thought you understood. Ella Sutton, walking toward the tray return station with her half-finished carton of juice still in hand, took one final sip while laughing at something Caleb said behind her. Her laughter caught mid-swallow, and for a brief, awful moment, she stopped walking entirely, one hand flying to her throat, her shoulders hunching forward. Torv shot upright from his seat so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing a few curious glances from nearby children. I grabbed his arm instinctively, though I could not have said whether I meant to restrain him or steady myself. Sanira was already on her feet as well, her earlier scientific calm completely gone, replaced by something closer to raw alarm. Her instruments, she told me later, had detected a sudden spike in Ella's vital signs, a clear indication that the girl's airway had briefly become obstructed, a genuine medical emergency by any standard we understood. On Ilith, an obstructed airway is treated as one of the most serious emergencies our medical teams ever respond to. Our bodies are simply not built to recover quickly from such an event. It requires immediate intervention, specialized equipment, and often days of careful monitoring afterward to ensure no lasting damage has occurred. I watched, frozen, as Ella coughed once, sharply, her whole body jerking forward with the force of it. Caleb, standing beside her, did not panic. He did not call for help. He simply reached out and patted her firmly on the back twice, an act so casual it barely interrupted their conversation, as though he had done this 100 times before and expected nothing less than a quick resolution. Ella coughed again, harder this time, and then, astonishingly, straightened up, cleared her throat once more, and let out a small laugh of her own, waving off Caleb's concern with an easy shrug. "I am fine," she said, her voice slightly hoarse, but otherwise completely normal. "Just went down the wrong way." She continued walking toward the tray return station as though nothing at all had happened, her earlier moment of genuine physical crisis already forgotten, already dismissed as a minor inconvenience unworthy of further attention. Sanira sat back down slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she reviewed her instrument's readings one final time. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Ella's vital signs had already returned completely to their earlier baseline, as though the emergency had simply never occurred at all. I asked her how quickly this recovery had happened. She said within seconds. Not minutes. Seconds. Dale, watching this unfold with wide, unblinking eyes, reminded us quietly that on Islith, a similar obstruction event would require immediate medical transport and likely several days of monitored recovery, with the patient's family notified, healers dispatched, and an official incident report filed with our health authorities. Here, on Earth, in this ordinary school cafeteria, the entire event had been resolved through 2 firm pats on the back from another child, followed immediately by a shrug and a return to normal conversation. Torv finally sat back down, though his hands remained visibly unsteady as he gripped the edge of our table. He said quietly that he needed a moment before he could continue the observation, and none of us blamed him for it. I found myself staring at Ella as she reached the tray return station, deposited her tray and empty containers with practiced efficiency, and turned to walk back toward her table to gather her remaining belongings before her next class. Her steps were light, unhurried, entirely unbothered, as though the moment we had just witnessed carried no more weight in her memory than the simple act of swallowing water. I thought of Sanira's earlier words about constant, silent battles happening beneath the surface of ordinary human existence, and I realized, with a growing cold feeling in my chest, that we had just witnessed a small, perfect example of exactly that principle in action. A genuine crisis had occurred, been handled through casual, almost reflexive intervention, and resolved within seconds, all without disrupting the surrounding rhythm of an ordinary school day, even slightly. Dale spoke first, his voice low and measured, though I could hear the effort it took him to keep it steady. He said that what we had just witnessed was not simply a demonstration of physical recovery, but something far more significant. It was evidence of an entire culture built around treating emergencies, even genuine ones, as manageable inconveniences rather than catastrophic events. He reminded us of Earth's historical records, the ones our scouts had compiled over decades of distant observation, wars that spanned generations, diseases that erased significant portions of populations, disasters, both natural and self-inflicted, that would have ended lesser species entirely. And yet, each time, humanity had recovered, rebuilt, and continued forward, treating catastrophe the same way Ella had just treated a blocked airway, as something to push through, not something to be defeated by. I asked him, quietly, what this meant for our delegation's continued presence on Earth. He did not answer immediately, and his silence told me more than words could have. Sanira, still reviewing her instruments, added one final piece of information that settled over our table like a physical weight. She said that during Ella's brief crisis, her body had released a measurable surge of what human physiology labeled adrenaline, a chemical response designed to prepare the body for immediate physical action in moments of danger. She explained that this surge, in most species, including our own, on the rare occasions we experienced genuine alarm, typically caused a loss of fine motor control, difficulty concentrating, and a lingering physical after-effect that could last for extended periods after the initial danger had passed. In Ella, this surge had appeared, peaked, and then faded almost entirely within the same brief window as her physical recovery, leaving no measurable impact on her subsequent behavior. She had walked, spoken, laughed, and continued her day with no apparent after-effect whatsoever. I turned to look at Torv, whose own hands had still not fully steadied from the shock of watching the event unfold, and I understood, with quiet, uncomfortable clarity, that our own species would have required considerably longer to recover from witnessing such an event, let alone experiencing it directly. Grace Dawson approached our table once more, this time with a slightly concerned expression, having noticed the sudden tension radiating from our small group. She asked if everything was all right, her voice gentle and genuinely caring. I assured her that we were simply processing a great deal of new information, which was, again, entirely true, though I suspected she had no idea exactly how much processing our small delegation now required. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ella occasionally choked slightly on her food, something about eating too quickly while talking, and that it was nothing to worry about, since it happened to most children from time to time. Nothing to worry about. I turned this phrase over in my mind repeatedly as Grace walked away to attend to another matter, marveling at how casually an entire species dismissed events that would have triggered emergency protocols across my own world. Dale, watching Ella gather her belongings and prepare to leave the cafeteria with the rest of her class, spoke one final observation that lingered long after he said it. He reminded us that Ella Sutton, the child we had just watched experience and recover from a genuine physical crisis within seconds, had been selected by her own teacher specifically because she represented nothing exceptional, nothing special, nothing beyond the ordinary baseline of her species. If this was ordinary, he said again, his voice quieter this time, almost fearful, then what exactly awaited us if we ever witnessed a human facing a threat they considered genuinely serious? None of us answered him, because none of us wanted to imagine the answer. Sanira finally closed her instrument, her earlier scientific fascination now fully replaced by something closer to genuine unease. She said quietly that she needed time to properly analyze everything her scans had recorded, though she suspected, even without further analysis, that her preliminary conclusions would only confirm what all of us already feared. Torv, still visibly shaken, asked in a low voice whether we should continue the remainder of our scheduled visit or request an early departure back to our ship. I did not answer him immediately, because part of me, the part that had traveled across the stars believing in careful diplomacy and measured observation, wanted to insist we continue our mission as planned, gathering complete information before drawing final conclusions. But another part of me, a quieter, more instinctive part that had never before needed to speak this loudly, was already calculating exactly how quickly we could reasonably excuse ourselves from this building, from this planet, from this species that had just demonstrated, within the span of a single lunch period, exactly why their world had earned its place among the most formidable in known space. Ella Sutton walked past our table one final time on her way out of the cafeteria, offering us a small, polite wave and a bright smile, entirely unaware that she had just become the central figure in what would soon become one of the most significant diplomatic reports our delegation had ever compiled. I raised my hand in return, offering what I hoped looked like a calm, friendly gesture, though my mind was already racing far ahead of that simple moment, toward decisions our delegation would need to make very soon, decisions that would determine exactly how we approached the remainder of our time on this extraordinary, terrifying world. The walk back through the school hallway felt longer than our entire descent through the atmosphere had been. Every human we passed seemed suddenly larger to me, though I knew, logically, that nothing about their size had changed since we arrived. Children ran past us in every direction, shouting, laughing, colliding into walls and each other, and where I had once seen only harmless chaos, I now saw something else entirely. A room full of small, resilient beings who could absorb impacts that would end my own kind, heal from wounds that would take my people entire seasons to recover from, and consume poisons with nothing more than a passing comment about the flavor. "Ambassador," Thal Voren whispered as we walked, his eyes fixed straight ahead, "do you think they know? What they are, I mean. Do you think the adults understand what their children are capable of?" "I do not think they think about it at all," I said quietly. "I believe, to them, this is simply what it means to be alive." We reached the outer doors, and the thick, heavy air of Earth's atmosphere pressed against us once more as we stepped outside, the sun beating down with a heat that felt, after everything we had just witnessed, almost fitting. A world this harsh could only ever produce a species this resilient. It made a terrible, undeniable kind of sense. Daniel Cross walked us to the edge of the landing area, his expression still carrying traces of confusion beneath his polite smile. "I hope this hasn't been too much of a disappointment, Ambassador. We were hoping this visit might be the start of something good between our peoples." "It has been," I said, choosing my words with great care. "Extremely informative, far more than we anticipated." "That's good to hear," he said, though something in his tone suggested he sensed the layers hidden beneath my careful diplomatic phrasing. "We'll look forward to your report then, and to hearing from you again soon, I hope." "Of course," I said, offering my hand once more in farewell, though I found myself unable to look at it without imagining, however unfairly, the quiet strength hidden beneath his calm exterior. We boarded the ship in silence, and the moment the doors sealed behind us, the careful composure each of us had maintained throughout the visit finally shattered. Thal Voren collapsed into his seat, both hands pressed against his face, his breathing ragged and uneven. Ilvath moved immediately to her console, her fingers flying across the controls with a speed I had never seen from her before, already preparing the emergency transmission we both knew needed to reach our leadership as quickly as possible. I stood at the center of the ship, my legs unsteady beneath me, and allowed myself, finally, to feel the full weight of everything we had witnessed. "Ambassador," Ilvath said, not looking up from her console, "I have compiled the preliminary data. Shall I begin the transmission?" "Yes," I said. "Send everything. Every reading. Every observation. They need to understand exactly what we found here." The ship's engines hummed to life beneath us as Ilvath began recording her formal report, her voice steadier now that she had a clear task to focus on, though I could still hear the tremor running beneath her words. "This is Delegate Ilvath Kor, transmitting on behalf of the Yosemite Accord Observation Team assigned to the planet designated Earth," she began. "We are recommending an immediate revision of this planet's threat classification, effective upon receipt of this transmission." I watched the ground fall away beneath us through the viewport as our ship lifted off, the school growing smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a gray rectangle surrounded by green, indistinguishable from any other ordinary building on this deceptively ordinary world. "During a single, unremarkable meal," Ilvath continued, "we observed a human child, age approximately 10 years by their own reckoning, consume multiple compounds that our medical database classifies as universally hostile to biological tissue, without any visible distress. We observed cellular repair rates nearly 4 times faster than our own species' baseline. We observed casual recovery from a partial airway obstruction without medical intervention. We observed the child absorb a high-speed physical collision with another child without sustaining apparent injury." Thal Voren finally lowered his hands from his face, his eyes, red-rimmed but focused now, listening intently as Ilvath's report continued. "Passive scans of the surrounding environment," she said, "indicate these traits are not unique to the individual we observed. Similar readings were detected across dozens of other children present in the same location, suggesting this level of physical resilience represents the baseline condition for this species rather than an exceptional case." I stepped closer to the console, adding my own voice to the recording. "This is Ambassador Corvin Thess. I wish to emphasize, for the record, that at no point during this visit did the child in question display any awareness of her own capabilities. She did not consider her actions remarkable in any way. If a single, ordinary member of this species, in its youngest and most vulnerable stage of development, possesses this level of resilience without any specialized training, I strongly recommend our leadership exercise extreme caution in any future dealings with this planet's adult population, particularly in any context involving conflict or negotiation from a position of pressure." Ilvath glanced toward me, her expression grim but resolved. "Shall I include a formal recommendation, Ambassador?" "Yes," I said. "Recommend immediate reclassification of Earth to our highest threat tier. Recommend all future contact proceed through careful, non-aggressive diplomatic channels only. and recommend, above all else, that no member of our people ever again underestimate a species based on the softness of their appearance or the gentleness of their smile. The ship climbed higher, the sky darkening from blue to black as we left the thick, heavy atmosphere of Earth behind us, and I allowed myself, finally, to breathe more easily, though the memory of that small, cheerful girl and her ordinary, terrifying lunch would remain with me for a very long time. "Ambassador," Thal Voren said quietly, once Ilvath's transmission had finished uploading to our relay system, "do you think we will ever return?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe we must," I said. "A species this resilient, this capable, cannot simply be avoided forever. But I believe our approach must change entirely. We came here expecting to meet a curiosity. We are leaving, having met something far closer to a marvel, and perhaps, if we are not careful in how we proceed, something far closer to a warning as well." Ilvath nodded slowly, her hands finally steady now that the report had been sent, the weight of her duty fulfilled. "I will admit, Ambassador, when we first received this assignment, I believed it would be among the simplest of my career. A single lunch, a single child. I did not expect to leave questioning everything I thought I understood about strength." "None of us did," I said quietly. Far below us, invisible now beneath layers of cloud and distance, Lily Turner was, at that very moment, walking back toward her classroom, her lunch bag tucked under one arm, chatting happily with a friend named Ellie about her drawing project, entirely unaware that she had just single-handedly convinced an entire alien delegation to recommend the highest possible level of caution when dealing with her species. "You know," she said to her friend, swinging her lunch bag lightly as they walked, "lunch was kind of boring today. Mom forgot to pack my favorite chips." Her friend laughed, nudging her gently with one shoulder. "You're always complaining about lunch. It's never that bad." "I guess," Lily said, shrugging easily, already moving on to thoughts of her afternoon classes, the aliens who had visited already fading into a pleasant, mildly interesting memory rather than the source of any lasting significance. She had no way of knowing that, far above her, aboard a ship racing back toward the edge of the solar system, an emergency transmission was already speeding across the stars, carrying with it a single, urgent message that would ripple through the halls of an entire alien government. Do not underestimate them. Do not provoke them. Above all, never assume that softness and safety are the same thing. Because somewhere on a small, blue, impossibly hostile world, a 10-year-old girl had just eaten an entirely ordinary lunch, complained mildly about missing chips, and gone back to class without ever once realizing that she had, in the span of 20 short minutes, become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the history of interstellar diplomacy. And far above her, aboard a ship trembling with quiet, lingering fear, 4 visitors from another world sat in silence, staring back at the shrinking blue planet behind them, already dreading, and yet already knowing, that they would eventually have to return. We did not run. I want to be clear about that, because when I later reported these events to our home council, several members assumed panic had driven our departure. It was not panic. It was instead a slow, mounting certainty that grew heavier with every passing minute, until leaving became not a choice, but an obvious necessity. Grace Dawson walked us back through the school hallway once the lunch period ended, chatting pleasantly about the afternoon schedule, mentioning that the children would soon move to something called physical education, followed by science lessons, and then a period for art. She asked if we would like to observe any of these additional activities before concluding our visit. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that our delegation had gathered a great deal of valuable information already and needed time to properly review it before continuing further observations. She seemed slightly disappointed but understanding, mentioning that she hoped we had enjoyed seeing a genuine slice of everyday human life. I assured her we had, which remained, in its own unsettling way, entirely accurate. As we walked, Dale quietly shared one final piece of information he had recalled from his earlier studies of human history, something that settled over our small group like a final, crushing weight. He reminded us that Earth's own historical records were filled with accounts of ordinary citizens, people with no special training, no exceptional abilities beyond what we had just witnessed in a single child, rising to face disasters, conflicts, and hardships that would have devastated entire civilizations on gentler worlds. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that human military forces trained specifically for combat represented individuals who had deliberately enhanced capabilities already present in ordinary citizens like Ella Sutton, refining reflexes, endurance, and resilience that existed, in smaller measure, in every single member of their species from childhood onward. I asked him, quietly, what this meant for any species that might one day find itself in conflict with humanity, whether through misunderstanding, competition for resources, or simple miscommunication between cultures still learning to understand one another. He did not answer directly. He simply looked at me with an expression that carried the answer clearly enough without words. We reached the school's main entrance, where our transport waited to carry us back to our ship. Grace Dawson shook each of our hands warmly, one final time, expressing hope that our visit had strengthened the growing friendship between our peoples. Torv, despite his earlier distress, managed a polite, steady handshake, though I noticed his fingers trembled slightly as he withdrew his hand. I thanked Grace sincerely for her hospitality, and I meant it, because nothing about her warmth or kindness had been anything but genuine. The unsettling truth we carried away from that school had nothing to do with any hostile intention on her part, or on Ella's part, or on the part of any human we had encountered. It had everything to do with the simple, staggering realization that an entire species had been shaped by their world into something far more resilient, far more capable, and far more formidable than we had ever properly understood. Once inside our transport, moving away from the school and back toward our ship, Sanira finally spoke the thought that had clearly been building in all of our minds throughout the journey. She said that her complete analysis, now finished, confirmed everything her preliminary readings had suggested. Ella Sutton represented, by every measurable standard, an entirely typical human child. Not enhanced, not exceptional, not selected for any special demonstration beyond her teacher's simple pride in a well-rounded student. If this was typical, Sanira said quietly, then humanity's true baseline capabilities, spread across billions of individuals throughout their entire species, represented something our delegation needed to communicate to our home council immediately, with the highest possible urgency. Torv asked what exactly she intended to recommend in her official report. She said, without hesitation, that she intended to recommend extreme caution in all future dealings with humanity, not because they had shown any sign of hostility toward us, but because their sheer physical and biological resilience meant that any potential conflict, however unlikely, would carry consequences far beyond anything our species had ever needed to consider before. Dale agreed, adding that our historical analysis needed serious revision as well. Every previous assessment our scholars had compiled about humanity's Deathworld origins had focused primarily on how their environment shaped their physical bodies. What we had witnessed today suggested something deeper, an entire culture built around resilience, endurance, and the casual acceptance of hardship that no amount of physical training alone could fully explain. I listened to my colleagues speak, each of them articulating pieces of the same growing realization, and I found myself thinking back to the moment Ella Sutton first opened her lunch container, back when I still believed, foolishly, that we were about to witness something gentle, something reassuring, something that would confirm humanity's harmlessness. Instead, we had witnessed a species capable of casually consuming substances designed to cause pain, enduring constant silent battles against disease without complaint, recovering from genuine physical emergencies within mere seconds, and treating catastrophic hardship throughout their history not as an ending, but as simply another obstacle to overcome on their way towards something greater. And this had all come from a single, unremarkable child eating an ordinary lunch. We arrived at our ship shortly afterward, and I immediately called an emergency session with our full delegation to begin drafting our report back to Ilith. I want to describe honestly what that report contained, because I believe future delegations deserve complete transparency about exactly what we discovered. Our report recommended, above all else, that Ilith approach any future dealings with humanity with careful respect rather than the mild condescension we had originally carried into our visit. We recommended that any trade agreements avoid, wherever possible, situations that might create genuine conflict or competition over resources, not because we believed humans desired conflict, but because their capacity to endure and ultimately overcome hardship meant that any prolonged struggle against them would likely end in ways deeply unfavorable to gentler species like our own. We recommended continued diplomatic contact, since nothing in our observations suggested humanity harbored any hostile intentions toward the wider galaxy. Quite the opposite, in fact. Every human we encountered, from Grace Dawson's warm hospitality to Ella Sutton's easy friendliness, displayed genuine curiosity and goodwill toward our delegation. But we also recommended, with the strongest possible emphasis, that our council understand clearly what kind of species we had encountered. Not monsters, not warriors seeking conquest. Simply an ordinary population of beings who had been shaped, generation after generation, by a world that offered no mercy, and who had responded to that lack of mercy not with despair, but with a quiet, casual resilience that ran through every single member of their species, down to the youngest child eating lunch with her friends. I submitted our final report 3 days after that visit, and I received a response from our council within the week, expressing both gratitude for our thorough observation and quiet concern about exactly what our findings implied for humanity's eventual role among the stars. Before our departure from Earth's orbit, I asked Illa, our young translator, whether she had learned anything from her time observing human language and culture that she believed our report had failed to capture. She considered the question carefully before answering. She said that throughout her studies, one thing had struck her more than any single biological finding Sanira had recorded. She mentioned a phrase she had heard repeated by human parents to their children throughout countless recordings she had studied before our arrival. A simple phrase meant to offer comfort during difficult moments. The phrase was this: "You are stronger than you know." She said she now understood that this phrase, spoken so casually, so frequently, throughout ordinary human life, was not simply comfort offered to frightened children. It was, in fact, a quiet, accurate description of an entire species' relationship with hardship, spoken so often that humans themselves rarely pause to consider exactly how true it was. I have thought about her words often in the time since our departure from Earth. I think about Ella Sutton, sitting calmly at her lunch table, eating food that would have caused genuine alarm among my own people, recovering within seconds from a moment of real physical danger, entirely unaware that her ordinary lunch had become the single most important piece of intelligence our delegation gathered during our entire mission. I think about Grace Dawson's warm, unsuspecting hospitality, offered freely to visitors from another world without any understanding of the quiet panic her simple invitation had caused among us. And I think, most of all, about how close we came to leaving Earth with our original assumptions intact, believing humanity gentle simply because their smiles were warm and their handshakes were friendly, never suspecting that beneath that warmth lived a resilience shaped by countless generations of hardship, a resilience so casual, so unremarkable to the humans themselves, that they displayed it freely over lunch without a single thought toward its significance. Our delegation left Earth's orbit quietly, professionally, with careful diplomatic messages promising future cooperation and continued friendship between our peoples. We did not flee in panic, exactly, though I will admit that our departure carried a quiet urgency none of us openly acknowledged at the time. We left because we finally understood, fully and completely, exactly what kind of species we had encountered, and exactly why the rest of known space had, for so long, watched Earth's slow, difficult rise from a very careful, very respectful distance. Somewhere below us, as our ship prepared for departure, I imagined Ella Sutton finishing her school day, walking home with Caleb perhaps, discussing whatever ordinary things children discuss, entirely unaware that she had briefly become the center of an interstellar diplomatic assessment. I imagined her mentioning to her family that evening, quite casually, that lunch had been fine that day, though perhaps slightly less interesting than usual. She would never know how wrong that small complaint truly was, nor would she ever understand exactly how much her ordinary lunch had revealed to 5 careful, increasingly humbled visitors from a distant, gentler world, visitors who left Earth's orbit that day with a newfound respect for a species that had learned, through countless generations of hardship, exactly how to survive, endure, and ultimately thrive on a world that had never once offered them mercy. We would return to Earth eventually, our council decided, though future visits would carry far more careful preparation than our first, and somewhere in the quiet corners of our own history, Ilith's records would forever contain a simple, humbling account of the day a full diplomatic delegation watched an ordinary human girl eat her lunch, and left the encounter forever changed by what that ordinary meal had revealed.